I use the word contradiction all the time, but if I were asked to define it, I genuinely have no idea what that means.
You mean like contradiction as a social phenomena or a social structure, not contradiction as a logical, like, the principle of non-contradiction or something.
I am literally asking you because I feel like there's
Why are you trying to disavow your responsibility?
This is What's Left of Philosophy. I'm Gil. Here with me today is Lillian.
Hello.
Will.
Hey.
And Owen.
That's good.
On today's episode, we're talking about the work of György Lukács, in particular his important 1923 book, History and Class Consciousness. Lucio Colletti once called it the first Marxist book after Marx, and it almost single-handedly made Marxism into a serious and respectable philosophical position. I'm tempted to say it's the most important work of Marxist philosophy in the early 20th century. Lukács, with this book, is considered to be one of the founders of a tradition referred to as Western Marxism, a term that rose to prominence with Maurice Merleau-Ponty's 1955 book, Adventures of the Dialectic. To be quick about it, Western Marxism can be understood as differing from the classical interpretation of Marx and Engels, as well as from so-called orthodox Marxism and Leninist philosophy. On this reading, Marxism is not just a new take on political economy, nor a sociological point of view, nor a science of history. Instead, Lukács stressed the Hegelian aspects of Marxist thought, articulating Marxist philosophy as a critical enterprise that seeks to revolutionize society through the proletarian classes coming to self-understanding. We read the central essay of the book, Reification and the Consciousness of the Proletariat, which explores some of these ideas. The essay is frankly kind of staggering in its philosophical sophistication and the depth of its analysis. So I'm going to try to very briefly lay out some of the main lines of thought before opening it up for all of you. Lukács develops, first of all, this central idea of reification. He frames this as an extension of Marx's analysis in the first chapter of Capital Volume 1 of the commodity form, and particularly of what Marx calls commodity fetishism. Now, I know all you three know this, but for the benefit of the listener, let me run that down real fast. By commodity fetishism, Marx means that relations between people come to appear as relations between things. Most obviously, the exchange value of a commodity, its price, is completely socially determined, right? It's a function of social relations, and it expresses something about the relationships between people as members of a society. But it looks like it's an objective quality of the thing, right? It looks like a static property that the commodity simply has. It appears as though the commodity possesses its price as a simple objective feature or a physical characteristic, but in truth, it's a function of social relations. Marx writes, quote, "The mysterious character of the commodity form consists simply in the fact that the commodity reflects the social characteristics of men's own labor as objective characteristics of the product of labor themselves, as socio-natural properties of these things," end quote. Reification, for Lukács, is the name for the fact that this commodity form progressively expands into all aspects of society. The fetishized commodity form, this substitution, where social relations appear as abstract objective features, becomes the exclusive form of appearance of objects. And at the same time, as I said, he's a good Hegelian, this universal dominance of the commodity form as the form of objectivity also means that it becomes the exclusive form of subjectivity as well. This has massive, wide-ranging consequences. First, just as the commodity's exchange value, numerical thing, comes to dominate over its qualitative physical characteristics, its use value, throughout society we see a similar reduction of quality to quantity. Subjectively and objectively, quantitative calculative rationality erases the supposed irrationality of qualitative differences and concrete singularity, washing them away in increasingly abstract properties. This abstraction makes everything a matter of detachable properties. Everything, both stuff that's external to us as well as we ourselves, comes to seem like it's just a mere bundle of properties that can be possessed or not and disposed of at will. We lose a sense of organic unity. This happens, for instance, in faculty psychology, where instead of treating a mind as something with some kind of holistic unity, we abstract out the different parts and treat them as really separable. You got the rational part of your brain, the thinking part, the judging part, the aesthetic part. Or again, our relationships to others appear as detachable from us, and we become relatively indifferent to them. Just as the commodity appears abstracted from its process of production, and its value appears abstracted from the social relations that are their real ground, we become these isolated, atomized individuals in bourgeois society. We become fully alienated from our own activity as workers, and the products of our labor confront us as an alien power that seems to follow objective laws that escape our control. So there's a kind of violent fragmentation involved in this phenomenon of reification, the splitting of individuals, subject and object alike, into abstract bundles of properties lacking any real unity or organic connection to concrete genesis. At the same time, however, this process is tied to a real unity in the form of totality. After all, we said that the commodity form becomes the dominant form of objectivity and subjectivity in society, and that process is universal in its scope. This has its roots in the universalizing movement of capitalism itself, which of course commodifies everything in the mad pursuit of the accumulation of value. Capitalism is a radically totalizing social system, and its fragmentation, consequently, is total as well. This is part of why Lukács argues for the philosophical significance of Marxism. It's not just empirical sociology or a new take on political economy, precisely because it retains this category, totality, without which this contradictory unity of fragmentation and universality in capitalism would be impossible to grasp. Lukács thinks, good dialectician that he is, that there are real contradictions here, ones that cannot be handled properly by bourgeois philosophy. The antinomies of the thing in itself have their real ground here, he argues, in the structure of the commodity form having become the universal form of thought and objectivity as a historical phenomenon. Now, of course, bourgeois philosophy thinks that it does handle these contradictions and antinomies properly by declaring them to be unresolvable. But that's because it's prey to an illusion. It thinks it has a universal perspective on society, but in the final twist here, Lukács says, no, it does not. The proletariat does. So the standpoint of the proletariat for Lukács is bound up with everything that we've said so far. It is, he says, the universal class. And that is a historically novel phenomenon. No class prior to it has ever had this universal status. If capitalism's commodification is total, if this process of reification is universal, then the proletariat is the negative of this totalizing process of abstraction. And as he writes, quote, the self-understanding of the proletariat is therefore simultaneously the objective understanding of the nature of society. He argues that although for bourgeois and proletarian alike, the immediate appearance of things is totally abstract and reified, the proletariat, however, has access through collective struggle to forms of mediation that give the lie to that appearance. Things get, I want to say, kind of speculative and a little unhinged at this point, if they haven't already seemed a little weird to you. Lukács gets almost prophetic toward the end of the essay when it comes to the standpoint of the proletariat. He says things that like, you know, the contradictions of bourgeois life in the commodity form will dissolve in the development of proletarian self-understanding. The thing in itself will dissolve as the proletariat becomes the self-conscious subject-object of world history and class antagonism is brought to an end.
Let's go.
New forms of it's tight.
Let's go.
But it's also bananas, right?
Yeah.
New forms of objectivity and consciousness will emerge, but they'll no longer be forms in which objects stand over against isolated subjectivity. What else? Time will no longer be dominated by space, you know, and so on, right? So there's like a lot to say. There's a lot more to say. I think the text is electric. It's super dense, and its aspirations and its scope are probably impossible to overstate. So hopefully I've done a halfway decent job at giving out a rough sketch of what's going on here, and I'm excited to hear what you all have to say about it.
Yeah, I have many thoughts. One, that was an amazing introduction.
Yeah.
That was awesome, Gil. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Gil.
So let's just maybe just to kick things off, what does Lukács mean by the proletariat? So from what I understand of engagements with Lukács, one might think that for Lukács, a proletariat is merely a sort of sociological category. I don't think that that's what it is, because if it were that, then he would fall prey to the critique that people often throw at Lukács is, you say the proletariat is, and let's just say the strange phrase is, the subject object of history. That the proletariat has this universal perspective. But then I go and talk to Joey Proletariat on the street, and it really does not seem as if he has some deeper insight to things than I do. And Lukács does address this. He goes, well, of course, empirical consciousness is the same as the empirical consciousness of the bourgeois. But the distinction I've seen in secondary literature is between empirical consciousness and imputed consciousness. And I think it's the imputed consciousness for Lukács, is he's saying, as a philosophical category, this is the function the proletariat would have to fulfill. And this can be true irrespective of whether the proletariat actually does accomplish this mission, and also irrespective of what Joey Prole is thinking in that particular moment. And so there's what I find interesting there.
Joey Prole, the plumber?
Yeah, I'm talking about back in 1920, it was Joey Prole, but now he's a plumber now. And so what's interesting there is Lukács, he clearly does not, because part of reification is the abstracting away of things that belong in some sort of totality or unity. But he's trying to understand, so what is the relationship between the empirical sociological category of the proletariat and the philosophical social totality concept of the proletariat? And so I guess my question is it that the philosophical concept in a way precedes the empirical concept, or does it inhere in the very actual living proletariat, or is the proletariat a stand-in for the subject that would unify society, even if that doesn't actually happen? So to kind of clean up my question, the fact that this that time is no longer dominated by space, all those things that Gil said, the fact that that didn't happen, does that quote-unquote disprove what Lukács wrote? I'm inclined to think not, but from what I gather, many people approach Lukács as if to say, well, these things didn't happen, so clearly you're reductive and you didn't get it.
Yeah, I like that question. I mean, I guess this is not going to be a sufficient answer, but one of the things that comes to mind is some of the language he uses when he describes the way that the proletariat and the bourgeoisie respectively relate to the illusions that exist within reified, capitalist society. He says they both live under the same illusions, but there's something in the experience of the proletariat that compels them to surpass those illusions. So there's a need that exists, whether the need comes to manifest itself in the actual surpassing of the illusions or not. There's something, he says, that forces the worker. There's a need that compels them to take on a role that is not just one more interest group inside of the social totality, but more this kind of historic role. So I don't know, maybe that need or that part of them that is compelled because they live that contradiction and become self-conscious of that contradiction between, like Gil was saying in the beginning, between quantity and quality, right? They know themselves as a qualitative, existence. They are humans with feelings and desires and needs, and they are reduced at every turn to quantitative calculation, the amount of labor time, the amount of, their wage, etc. Right? And so they know that contradiction, and that compels, there's some need in them to surpass. The illusion is less, I guess, it works less compellingly on them than it does on the bourgeois class. So I don't know, maybe that's one place to look to start answering that.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think about this a lot in terms of, as this is an idea I think that Lukács himself draws attention to, in this transition from, in Marx's Capital One, from the sphere of exchange or circulation to the sphere of production, where you're looking at the same process, but everything changes its tone and tenor, right? Everything's got a different sort of valence, where we're no longer thinking about the kind of niceties of exchange, and instead are noticing the kinds of ways in which violent subjection and coercion are at every stage of the process required and mandated. And it is, at least, I mean, to go back to your question, Will, you gave a couple of candidates for how to think the relationship between empirical and imputed consciousness. And I'd like to think through this a little more carefully, right? It's as though there is a possibility for this class consciousness on the part of the proletarian to form. And it's not just a it's not just a potentiality, right? Like there are like moments in which that self-understanding clearly does exist, but also we do have to live with this gap and try to make sense of, why is it that empirical consciousness lags behind the position that Marxism would like to impute to it?
Yeah, maybe we could say that like because they are themselves commodified, labor time is itself commodified, the life process of the worker is itself commodified, that they're uniquely well situated to understand the commodity form as the dominant and determining form of capitalist society, whether the step is taken to actually achieving that self-understanding and understanding of social totality or not.
I think that's right. And so I guess, one might wonder, here's the way that I will put it. So the proletariat has, this standpoint that Lukács is realizing they are the only class that through their self-understanding will, be able to dispel the illusions of reification. My question is, how is that markedly different than Lukács, who we might assume is not a proletariat, but he has worked this out? So does that mean that it is in principle like, the bourgeoisie, what if they read Lukács and they agree? Is there something different in the proletariat than simply understanding what Lukács said? What is missing here? I mean, I think the thing that's missing is going to have to do something with praxis. Yeah, but I think it's important to cash out. Lukács is clearly making more of a statement than we need to get our philosophical argumentative ducks in a row. And thus, that creates some sort of social transformation. Instead, what he's saying is that, maybe there has to be a convergence with self-understanding and material interest for this to be the motor. But I guess I'm trying to work through, what's the relation between the philosophical argument that he makes, that if we accept it, but simply accepting it is not enough to break through the illusion of reification. The last thing I was going to say is reification, its relationship to commodity fetishism, is it simply a distortion of how things appear to us? Or is it also related to how we are coerced to conduct ourselves in such a society? That even if we see through the abstraction, we must still live and act as if the abstraction were real.
Very important point. I think that's absolutely right.
So I think that maybe it might be helpful to try to understand why this is not like standpoint epistemology as we usually understand it. There's some analogous lines of reasoning, but I think it specifically has to do with the commodity form, how universal you think that is, and then whether or not that has significance for the dynamics of social change equally as universally. So it's not just a way of knowing relative to social position. It's a way of knowing relative to a total social process. And what you do in that social process has reverberations for the totality in a distinct way. So I think this distinct way that's on offer is the distinction Marx makes between labor and labor power, which, some time ago I didn't actually understand what was at stake in this at all. I was like, okay, people keep making that distinction and it is whatever, you sell your labor. But I think that's really key for Lukács, because you don't just sell your labor, you sell your labor power, which means that the commodity that the individual laborer becomes, that's what the abstraction is. And that's what the reification is. There's a part of you that becomes separate from you and the same from you at the same time. This is very strange. So then commodity fetishism is a way of objectifying yourself at the same time that others are objectifying you in this process. And then I guess the point is that because proletarians are commodified in this way, when they start getting together to try to act on their interests, they might see that these interests very narrowly, and even the institutions that they that they create might see their interests very narrowly. But the act of having to organize such a diverse plurality of needs and interests kind of creates a counter hegemonic effect in a way that that other kinds of organization does not, and that's what creates the universal class. There's this kind of capacity for what would later in the Marxist tradition be, or I guess maybe earlier with Gramsci, be called the counter hegemony, and that whole analysis depends on how much you buy the universalizing concept of. So it's universal relative to a universal. It's not like universal relative to like anything period ever.
Yeah.
And then if you don't think that capitalism has those qualities, then this is just not going to work for you.
Yeah, a lot hinges on the extent to which the commodity form is the arch determining structure of capitalist society as a whole. Maybe it's worth actually pausing and talking a little bit about what he thinks bourgeois thought is and why it gets things wrong, right? Because he has this, and why proletarian class consciousness is obviously different and more, better situated or uniquely situated to understand social totalities. So he says about bourgeois thought that there's a number of things about it, but one of the most important things is that it's hyper rational about isolated, restricted phenomena, but incapable of understanding in any rational way what the social totality is doing, right? So it understands some particular aspect of the production process. It understands some aspect of the science of mining or something, right? But when it comes to the actual whole of what is the logic of this system, what is it doing, where is it going, where does it come from, they are stuck in, well, I find it really interesting. He says they get stuck in a number of illusions that he says you can see in bourgeois, what he calls bourgeois philosophy. So you take Adam Smith, and there's really minute analyses of aspects of capitalist exchange. But then there's this thing the invisible hand, which is the explainer of the social totality, which comes in as a kind of, short circuit to explain the social totality. It's the same thing with Kant, who ends up with a notion of the progress of history that he can't really found in his his science of cognition. So he has this thing called a moral world author, which comes in, which we can't prove, but we can have the idea of
based.
It allows us.
I love how Gil just starts dying.
Yeah, but the moral world author is a short circuit to making sense of the whole, right? To make sense of where the whole of history is going and making sense of totality. And so, if the commodity form is the structure, the thing that gives structure to the totality of capitalism, that suffuses and determines all aspects of political, social, cultural life, in capitalism, and the proletariat as a commodified entity themselves is uniquely situated to understand that process of commodification, including its contradictions and whatever, then they are in a position to make sense of the social totality in a way that when you're only focused on the kind of hyper scientific understanding of isolated aspects of society, you'll never be able to make sense of. Does that make sense?
What's key, and I liked your language of the short circuit. I want to throw this at you, but I was hearing a little bit of Zizek there.
That term is definitely a term that too much Zizek on YouTube.
I'm not saying you were doing that, but
no, it is a term that I probably have just imbibed from him.
But it seems the problem with bourgeois thought is that it can't think mediation. So it has to constantly make these leaps from the particular to the universal. And what Lukács does really well in that long second section is, none of these things are really able to bring these two things together. It's just, kind of a hodgepodge of there has to be something, but also there's this particular, and so mash them together and that gives you totality. But he's very clear to whatever he means by social totality, and I don't want to go too quickly on this, is not you just add A, B, C, D up and then you have totality. It's not enumerative. And so what he means by the philosophical concept of totality is seeing how the logic of the whole is even expressed in the very particular activities in which you engage. And so it seems to me that the proletariat, their standpoint is different because they do not have the luxury of disavowing or not understanding the rich mediations that are layered within their lives. That when they go go to do X, they see that doing X involves this whole series of relations and social logics and constraints. When they go to do Y, they find these relations of logics and constraints. And so it is not for them a simply academic exercise. I think he, pejoratively calls the contemplative attitude of, so there's you at work, there's you at home. There's you in a social club, there's you And those things simply fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, but there isn't any imminent reason that unites why those activities take the form that they do. And so I think it was really important. And when he was talking, I've been listening to this podcast, and I've actually found it really helpful to really get inside the brain of liberalism. So many of the people who come to the podcast, they are deeply hostile to the notion of social totality.
Yeah, what are we talking?
Wait,
do you want to name them?
Do it. Drop it.
Yeah, okay. Gil, you can edit this out. It is called... Which, well done, by the way. Great stuff on there. Trying to be, I can listen to people I disagree with. But this notion that there is a whole, they are deeply antagonistic to, because there's no way you could ever know that. All of these people on there who would describe themselves as classically liberal, they all say something Lukács would hate, which is we could never know. We could never know about these interests, and so that's why liberalism is really important.
That's a Hayek vibe, though, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah.
That's why planning is impossible. That's why crises are never imminently engendered. That's why they're always exogenous shocks.
And there can be no sense of unification. They're just irreconcilables. You believe X, I believe Y, nothing will bring these two things together, so better to leave the space open rather than what Lukács calls social totality. The proletariat really actually encapsulates this form of life so that we can go beyond it, which means enclosing it rather than simply opening it up.
So I just want to ask quickly, because I think what you're getting at is the problem of contradiction, and I've always wondered what what a contradiction actually is for...
Same.
For Lukács.
All right, well, let's just hammer that out real fast.
Yeah, I just think it would be useful because what I was saying earlier about the way that working people, if they organize themselves and they have to get all these interests together, and then they have to kind of confront the labor process and their own objectification. I feel so there's interests involved there, but in order to coordinate those interests, if there were no contradiction, there would be no problem. But it's having to do that and to confront a contradictory reality, and it's in that confrontation that they become the subject object. And I genuinely don't know what I use the word contradiction all the time, but if I were asked to define it, I genuinely have no idea what that means.
You mean contradiction as a social phenomena or a social structure, not contradiction as a logical, the principle of non-contradiction or something?
I am literally asking you because I feel there's...
Why are you trying to disavow your responsibility? I feel the three of us should be able to hammer something out that is useful. I'll offer myself up as tribute. So what Lukács means by contradiction is clearly something more substantive than abstract disagreement. It is not, let's say, water is the opposite of fire. What I think you're supposed to get with the notion of contradiction that Lukács is clearly getting from Hegel is a contradiction that is one, it is not arbitrary or contingent. It is necessary to this form of life that we have. Two, a contradiction is not something that you can simply evade as if there was some conceptual error, but it is, so let's use the language of social forces or objects. They not only oppose one another, but they also constitute one another at the same time. And so reification, think of it this way. Reification is a contradiction insofar as it is something that, Lukács thinks, it harms our understanding of the world, but you can't simply abstract it out as if this was a logical error error. It is actually something required by what it means to have a society structured by the commodity form. So all at once, it brings together our social activities, and yet it also prevents us from understanding our social activities and social life. And so one might think, in a more sort of liberal vein, there aren't contradictions, there are disagreements, and we can kind of tame those disagreements or decide which disagreements are less necessary, less important. But I think a robust understanding of contradiction is to say that this isn't a deformation of this form of life. It is actually necessitated by it. And it also is what opens the way to an alternative or a new form of life, because it shows that this form of life is inherently unstable. But again, necessarily so. So it's not something you can simply manage and tamp down. So I'll hand it over to Gil there. I did my best.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'd also add that, I think for Lukács, it seems like there's a couple of things that he points to as contradictions, but the one that I keep coming back to, and which I think that must be maybe most important for him, has to do with the apparent contradiction between atomization or isolated fragmentation and unity or totalization. And this is something that he ties, again, specifically to capitalism as a mode of social organization as something historically novel, where previous forms of social organization were nothing other, I think he would say, were nothing other than these sorts of conflicts of interests that Will was just talking about. But that we want to use the word, the language of universality. We want to say something like, we are all alone and isolated, right? Mm-hmm. That's an immediate contradiction. Because if we're all this way, then we're not alone. But it's also the case that we're saying something real about, at the very least, our subjective lived experience, if not something more strongly, objectively true about this social form. And the proletariat is, for the first time, able to say something like that concretely and adequately, right? The bourgeois can't say that. But so it's how do you come to recognize or understand that we are all atomized, in fact, means that we aren't at the same time, right? That there is an objective basis for a concrete universality there in the form of struggle or of emancipation. It's something new. I mean, this is all trying to get at to answer your question, Lillian, and I think we both immediately, Will and I, we're not obviously talking about logical contradiction. We're doing something much closer to a Hegelian social understanding of contradiction. It is something that's built into the structure of society and social life. The other version of this that I was thinking about, right, is that he seems to have this very, we were talking before we started recording about how cool it is to go back to these older thinkers and how non-beholden they are to contemporary academic fads are. But he's a real process thinker, or someone who's really interested in relations and how relations give rise to things that then look like they're non-relational, right? And that, again, is a necessary illusion, a necessary form of appearance of the kind of world in which we live. And the question isn't okay, dispel it, right? Dispel the, so stop thinking about stuff as stuff. This glass of boba tea I got, that's not really a thing. It's actually a set of relations. That's a very silly thing to suggest, right? It is obviously both, but there's something about the way in which these things appear as static, as abstract, as isolated, without any real unity or connection to these processes and relationships. There's something about that appearance, that form of appearance, that needs to be broken through. And he thinks, right or wrong, again, this is maybe where he's, like I said, it gets real messianic and bananas toward the end of the piece. He just thinks that this is the proletariat's job historically. and something that it's uniquely capable of doing because of its social and historical situation.
Yeah, but I also want to add to that. It's not logical contradiction. So
right. I think so too. I'm glad you said that. I was oh God,
Yeah. It is both.
Yeah, because the Society of Reification, if we wanted to put a phrase that sounds logically contradictory yet captures the social totality, is antisocial sociality. It is if we wanted to put it in a nice form of logical proof, it is A and not A. And one might think, well, you can't have your cake and eat it too. Either this is a deeply antisocial place, and the problem is we don't have sociality, and thus we need that sort of like romantic anti-capitalist critique of, capitalism destroyed the communal bonds. We no longer have families, we no longer have clans, whatever. That's sort of historically the romantic anti-capitalist critique. Or you have sociality, and it turns out, well, no, it's not antisocial. This is just a new way for us to be together. And it's great. We're not like, our lives aren't hinged to these weird traditional hierarchies, to nature, etc. And Lukács would say, well, you're not thinking through the process, that this anti-sociality is a form that yokes us together as a social group. And us, now I'm thinking of like talking as the proletariat, that the proletariat can understand living, subjectively and objectively, this relationship of antisocial totality, of being all at once deprived of the linkages that would allow for cooperation in your interests, and yet being bound together within a social form that you cannot escape. And it seems to me, buried in Lukács, and then I'll say the other thing about what Gil said at the end, buried in Lukács, there's a messianism, but I guess he thinks it's different than utopianism, because he thinks, there is a drive in life to have some sort of logically consistent unity. And that's why he describes the proletariat as subject-object, to finally bring these together in rich mediation, which is exactly what the commodity form does not let us do. We're yoked together, and yet our very modes of being yoked together tend to attenuate and weaken our social bonds. But you're right, there is something very strange that while I was reading Lukács, I was like, ew, isn't this also a form of a type of functionalism that's going on here? That, even though Lukács wants to speak to the subjective, it seems as if, for Lukács, it is really objective constraints that slot us, impersonally into roles we are forced to play. And that is, the part that I thought is harder for him to bring together, because all at once the commodity form yokes us into these roles that we cannot simply just subjectively put down, and yet self-knowledge and experience are important for the overcoming of these reified relations.
Why do you call it what do you say, functionalism? I'm not sure I followed that.
By functionalism, I guess what I mean is these sets of relations are such because they are of a benefit to the social totality, to capitalist society. And so, the proletariat is in this position not simply because of forces of violence and domination, but because, that is the way this society has to be arranged in order to reproduce itself. The type of critique of functionalism is it drains out notions of conflict, and it overly rationalizes as if there were a moral world author who's like, okay, proletariat goes here, capitalists go there, bourgeoisie goes there, and that's how this is all arranged. And so it can seem as if when he is talking about the role of the proletariat is that, this will be what, they must do. This will be their function.
I mean, this is interesting too, because so one of the other things that people often say about Lukács is that he sort of anticipated, he writes this a decade or so before the publication of the 1844 manuscripts. And a lot of the humanist Marxism that we get in the 20th century, based on that, places special emphasis on this concept of alienation, right, for which it's alternatively celebrated or condemned. And Lukács has already got his sort of finger on this, and it's sort of what people say is that it's validated. His analysis is sort of validated after the fact by the publication of the 1844 manuscripts, because you don't need a moral author of the world for things to have this kind of functionally coordinated structure, right? The thing about capitalism is that it is in fact a unified economic system. It actually does organize society in these ways with, yes, some deleterious social consequences. We all know how bad it is for your body to be part of the division of labor. But on the other hand,
not great.
Look at what it does though, right? On the other hand, right? And this is the sort of thing, it prepares the way for something like a universal self-understanding and the possibility of grasping society as a totality by its own immanent logic, which he thinks, following Marx in Capital One, is already there contained in the commodity form. It's already there. And, there was, as he cites Marx saying, like, sure, there was commodity exchange in previous modes of social organization. It didn't become this, though. Mm-hmm. It didn't become like a universal, totalizing, all-encompassing structure, which, I mean, you said at the beginning, one of you said, like, everything seems to hinge on whether or not we buy that. But, like, I don't know how you could refuse the claim in a certain sense. Like, being honest, looking around at the world in which we live, like, a universal commodification seems to just be a fact. I don't know what really does escape it. And like, I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. I don't know what you all think about that. Yeah.
I mean, there's the odd, I guess, like welfare state attempt to like shield certain things, like, I don't know, healthcare from commodification. It doesn't obviously entirely do that.
I mean, by the way, maybe I only really think that it's universal because I live in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. is for sure the purest example. But
check your privilege, sir. Sit down and listen.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like from like critical theory land, the objection is usually that, like, ontologically speaking, it can't be commodities all the way down. And normally people talk like because the thought is that if that were true, then you can't have conflict, or there's nothing in subjectivity that's external to the commodity form, and therefore there's no basis for social criticism and subjectivity. I'd be interested to know what you think about that. I feel less and less compelled by that claim, because I feel like the argument that he's making is that there is indeed a base. But anyway, and then the other thing is usually like a Neo-Polanyian.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I don't think he would disagree with that.
Right. I think that the other argument is like a Neo-Polanyian argument, where like the true motion of capitalist society is a movement of marketization and resistance to marketization. So you're never going to have total commodification, and that's what creates conflict in capitalist societies.
Maybe the way to reconcile it is to say that like the commodity has a structuring function over everything, but it doesn't subsume everything without remainder, right? Like it quantifies and it seeks to quantify everything, but there's still a kind of qualitative element of life that, I don't know if you would put it this way, but is never entirely or fully subsumable within that quantitative totality, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think Lukács, we're catching him at a period. And again, I'm in no way a Lukács scholar, but I've just randomly read stuff recently, so don't hold me to this. But, before he wrote this, Lukács went through a real sort of Kierkegaardian romantic phase when he's talking about aesthetics and the novel, and he's working his way out of it. But then you see glimmers of it here, where he's talking about how reification attempts to to harm and mutilate the very force of human life, and yet it doesn't go all the way to doing it. So I think he's trying to work his way out of it, because when we do our episode on Ernst Bloch, this is going to come up, where Ernst Bloch thinks that there's something indomitable. There is a material essence of utopianism that is continually pushing back against the attempts to capture and mutilate it. But I think Lukács is trying to work his way out of that, because I think I more agree with you, Owen, but I wonder if what Lukács is saying is, well, the reason why there's a critical vantage point is because this is a social totality that's inherently contradictory. It actually calls forth in this very movement of totalization, universalization, its own critique. And so there isn't a need to posit something that escapes its movement. It is that, the movement to commodify, to create what I was calling this antisocial sociality, is also going to, necessarily draw forth the critical vantage point of the proletariat that can no longer live within that social contradiction. And I've been thinking about that as well. I believe, Nancy Fraser, I think, says a little bit about, it's not commodities all the way down in the book Capitalism with 𝙁𝙗𝙙𝙬𝙗𝙗. And I think that doesn't quite touch what Lukács is doing, because I think for him, the critical consciousness isn't something that must be conserved from the commodity form. It's that the commodity form, given the commodity it's engaging with, which is the labor, the proletariat, the human spirit, is going to be the critical edge.
It's going to generate it.
Is going to generate it. And so I think, Owen's with me on this, and I always love getting the snaps from Owen.
I thought that was brilliantly put.
I think
Yeah.
that's the Lukáčian response to that. Well, it made sense to Owen.
Yeah.
I mean, like, add too that, like, you know, it's not so much about commodification as like a to say like an actual process, right? Like, we're not talking so much about like taking stuff that was in the commons and making it available to like market mediation. For him, he's much more interested in the commodity as a form, right? And as a form of subjectivity and of objectivity. You know, I was thinking about like in another way of trying to get at the like what is a contradiction question. Like, you read the first critique by Kant, which he's obviously read very carefully, and you got this like whole set of problems about like how does the subject actually interact with anything actual, the thing in itself, in consciousness. And you have to just introduce, like you said, bourgeois thought can think mediation. So he just like jams the schematism in there, and he's like, the schematism does it. It's the thing that mediates between subject and object. And you read that chapter and it's like, I don't know how this is supposed to solve any of the problems. It's like, this is just like a thing. And Lukács is like, I've got an answer to that question. How do the subject and object get mediated? And the answer is the schematism is provided to you by the commodity form. The commodity form is the schematism.
So it's doing a much deeper, like, logical work than just privatizing or marketizing things, right? Like, that's why he thinks he's examining aspects of commodity logic when he's reading like Kant's Critique of Pure Reason and the Critique of Judgment, right? Like, there he's examining commodity logic. And so it's a facet, it is so pervasive into consciousness that it's a determining facet of even the most seemingly speculative and abstract philosophy. So I really like that point, Gil, actually. It's not just, it's distinct. Commodification, as he's using it, is a force that is distinct from just like privatizing or marketizing.
Privatizing and marketizing would be the appearance. And what he's trying to get at is, what is the logic immanent in the appearance? And so one might say that to critique, the sort of commodity form all the way down as, well, not everything is made available to the market. In fact, one might think the solution is, well, let's take some things off the market, and that solves the problem of the commodity form. Lukács would say, you're staying at the level of appearance. Right. You're not thinking at the level of the logic of the social totality, which is, if he can show that it's even at work in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, like, what? Yo, come on, this is wild. This is wild. Yeah. But if he is right and offers a compelling argument, which I do find it rather compelling, then he's saying that's still a mystified way of looking at it. You simply stay at the level of marketization. So there might even be a kind of proto-critique here of Polanyi, but I kind of hope we do an episode on Polanyi because I think he's kind of interesting. But yeah. So you have to get into a richer form of mediation.
I mean, so we don't need to make this all about Polanyi because that's not what this is about. But I feel like I think Lukács has a really compelling response to that kind of argument, and it's like already in what he's saying to Bernstein and the like kind of disses he's throwing at like the emerging like social reformers in that old social democratic sense, not like in the new social democracy is distinct from socialism sense, like the old social democracy where reforms were actually going towards socialism sense. His argument against the social democratic reformers is like, you think that you can have this kind of progressively demarketizing a force, like, because you see this as a problem of marketization. So if you push back the forces of the market and you constrain it, then you can kind of make its influence ever smaller. But I have news for you, homie. It's just going to keep fighting you back, and that's indeed what happens in social democracies, right? So like, it's not that it's impossible to fight or contain or for a period of time control. It's that the commodity logic is going to keep pushing back on that because it is the dominant logic of the social form. So there's a gravitational force around like capital accumulation in the commodity form or the law of value that you can't just like squander away with your reforms and with the state and institutions and the law. Like, in Europe, everyone asks me about the law. I swear to God, Americans never ask me about the law because our law like doesn't fucking work, So, and like Europe, we don't even have it, and it's so hostile.
Our law's pure vibe, baby.
It's totally pure vibe.
Vibes and violence, 2022.
Totally. I mean, but so it's interesting as a point of comparison because when I talk about like class conflict to Americans, like their beefs with me are totally different. No one asks about the law. In Europe, everyone asks me about the law, and it's because they really think the law can control this shit. And they're the only people, sorry, I'm going to make some Europeans listening mad, but like they're the only population on the planet that thinks that, because there's 10 billion people, sorry, not 6. And they're all subject to this, to these imperatives, and only this small population of people have been able to use the law effectively. But they really think that that's, and so that's bourgeois thinking right there. There you go.
Yeah.
That's bougie shit.
Lukács has a whole section of the essay where he talks about how the law and the operation of the law under capitalism is also totally determined by commodity logic.
Commodity form.
The commodity form by quantification. Yeah.
He's like, this is where we get like the critique of the like then emerging bureaucratic state, where he's like, how do you think that this is a check on any?
And you
of
have
that?
to, the bureaucratic state under capitalism tries to like subsume ever like more complex issues under like the most violent formalization, in which you have to apply in increasingly absurd ways universal standards to very particular situations.
Wow.
And he says, it's a perfect critique.
For some reason, just flashed in my mind the meme of all the Spider-Mans pointing at one another. No, you're the commodity. No, they're like, y'all are all the commodity structure, it looks like to me. But also to like bring this back around, you can only gain this insight philosophically if you're committed to a concept of social totality. If you are not, then there is no way of having the insight of you can contain the market for a bit, but what you need to see is that the language Lillian uses, the gravitational pull will push back. And the point that Lukács wants to make is once you have the concept of social totality, you have the concept of transforming or overcoming, whichever language you want to use, that's social logic as such. You're not simply reifying that social logic as that is just the way the world works. That is just a law of nature. Right. That's like you saying you want to overcome gravity. You're not going to overcome gravity. That's just nature. And it seems to me without social totality, you can find yourself committed to the idea of saying these conditions are simply the way things are. And then you'll be constantly confused as to why when you seem to make progress in one arena, just like 5, 10, 20 years later, all of a sudden that starts receding. And you can start making arguments of like, well, it's just a deeply imperfect world. That's just it is what it is. And you can make cogent arguments like that, but then don't make any pretenses to being committed to anything like broad transformation or I don't want to say revolution because I know what can be attached to that. But you're overcoming social totality. Just like say that you're just about this life and only this life, and we're having two different
and
conversations.
You wish it were different, but
Yeah. And you'll be like, kind of a bummer, but it is what it is. We're fallen people. XOXO.
XOXO.
I mean, I'm just going to start having these conversations and just be like, aha, another bourgeois antinomy. I feel you, my friend. That's the best of us.
Yeah, I think you should just like say that as soon as they're done. They're waiting for a long response. We're like, oh, bourgeois antinomy.
Yeah.
Got
so
it.
I actually caught
Antinomy?
myself having the exact same thought, like sitting imagining going to like 20 different papers at a conference, like, damn, just another bourgeois antinomy. Just another goddamn bourgeois antinomy.
You should just stand up and say, like, if I wanted to read a bourgeois antinomy, I would have read Kant's Critique of Pure Reason.
I would have just
You,
read
sir,
Kant's
are no
critique's
Kant.
better. Yeah, you're no Kant. I don't know about that.
Oh, man.
I mean, I like the way that like he put to connect this back to like the law. The law example is really nice because he talks about jurisprudence. And of course, I've been thinking a lot about jurisprudence recently for obvious reasons. Again, living in hell, the United States in 2022.
Yeah.
But like there's like this where he talks about like jurisprudence. It's toward the end of the first part of the essay. And it's like this like weird, again, reified idea that like there's actually nothing for a subject to do in interpreting the law, right? It's as though like laws are just like their sense and meaning is like a matter of objective, neutral fact, right? And then like lawfulness and the orderliness of like a lawful structure becomes the sort of standard form of objectivity, but in this calculative, rational way. So like, so-called originalism or textualism is supposed to be this like jurisprudential logic of like exempting oneself from the work of interpretation, letting the thing itself speak, right? The fucking die Sache selbst of the law, right? Just like speaks its own name. And it's like, that's gibberish. That's not a thing. That's never made any sense. And like, how do you like insist at the same time that like the form of, he's talks so disparagingly of professional lawyers. It's very funny. But like, this is, I think
we love it.
Yeah, get him. I think this is part of why, right? Like, this is like the subject feels like it's once again confronted by something totally out of its grasp, out of its controls. Listen, it's not me. It's what the Constitution said, buddy. And it's like, well, what is that? As though, again, that's not like a product of social relations expressing a social totality in a determinate historical moment.
Yeah.
And not like a human product, but like is the Constitution of the United States have the same status as gravity? Like, what are we talking about, right?
Well, Gil, have you considered the idea that maybe God wrote the Constitution?
I did, but God did write it, but qua natura naturata, not natura naturans, okay?
Wow, that's a nerdy joke. I loved it.
Yeah, that one's for the 6 listeners who are going to pick up on that.
They're howling. They're dying.
They're having a ball. I kill at very specific clubs. Yeah.
Oh man, I love when he like gets into the like frustration, like of dealing with a totally irrational. The way he describes like a totally irrational totality with like hyper local rationalization.
Yes, local rationalization.
Like really hyper local rationalization in all these different spheres, like law, for example, right, or bureaucracy, or obviously the market and the economy.
Yeah, the critique of bureaucracy. It's
yeah.
So good.
And it's, I don't know, I love the kind of like contradiction between this hyper local rationality and total global irrationality comes out in all these different forms, right? He says like, well, we, at one point, I can't remember how he puts it, but he says something like, impersonating the bourgeois mind, saying, man, we invented this great new technology. It's like going to feed everybody. And then like starvation like increases or whatever. Or like, oh, you know what I mean? Like, oh, we invented this thing that's supposed to make we invented these machines that's supposed to make us have to work less. Oh my God. Like somehow in reality, we're all working way more, right? And they can never understand how this happens because they don't understand what's driving the social totality and the fact that no one's driving it and like it has no rational ends of its own. You know what I mean? It's totally beholden to the logic which determines all the isolated rationalities. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's so good.
And I think about like, I was thinking about the example of like the electric car. Like, there's all these different like green, like, technologies that we keep getting introduced to, and climate change keeps like accelerating at faster and faster paces.
Worse and worse.
You know what I mean? And it's like, well, why is this happening? Like, and it's happened. And the reason why it doesn't make any sense to us is because we have no fucking concept of like the social totality. Like what is actually happening, like what's relating to and driving all of these isolated innovations,
Yeah.
I'm just dying because Owen is like, the big totality is determining all the little totalities.
It is. No, but it's like why we can't fucking do anything about anything, like about climate change, about any of these crises. Like we can't do anything because we're not in charge. It's a totally fucking big irrational thing that's in charge.
And Lukács says like the division of labor, the specialization of skills destroys every image of the whole.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's like, yeah, well, here we are. I got no idea what's going on with the whole, but I'm looking at this thing over here, and it seems like it makes a little bit of local sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me just hyper-focus on that.
I'll just fixate.
No.
I'm
going to fixate entirely on, like, we're going to make car batteries, like, so much more efficient. I'm going to fucking look at this shit for 10 years. And, like, eventually, if I just focus on this, the big thing will also get solved. I know it.
And but there's just like the classic, that hasn't worked out for anybody else, but for us, maybe for us.
But this is like last pitch. This is why I think that like this philosophical move that he makes, because he thinks that totality is like thought for the first time in Marxist thought, right? And like this is why you don't get to totality by adding shit up, right? It's not an additive concept.
Well, the method for discovering totality, he says, comes from Hegel, but only the method, right? Marx actually achieved the understanding.
Right, yeah, which we love to see.
Yeah. How can you argue with that?
You gotta love the idea of like, Hegel, the way he did it is cool, but he does not get credit. No.
We can't give him total credit. No, he's still a bourgeois thinker.
Have you read the civil society chapter? I mean, no, that ain't it.
That ain't it. Yeah, the last thing I will say is I actually just think the philosophical concept of social totality, despite how I think, in many ways has been very discredited in the contemporary formation of the academy, is deeply important and worthy of a return to investigation. And it's actually the concept I use to bring my Du Bois class together, saying he's a thinker of social totality. He's trying to be, at least, for whatever his shortcomings. And when you lose that, you actually do lose the richness of a lot of historical thinkers. So I can see why people would be like, Lukács, what a weirdo and a dummy. If we have so lost the notion of social totality, then what he's saying, I guess somebody can just look like mysticism. It's like, what?
Yeah, and
this?
And shouts out to Sartre, the critique of dialectical reason, for taking up the concept of totality and totalization as well. Respect.
Always a shout out.
I also
have to do that episode at some point.
I think this is right. I was so even in my moments where I was fully persuaded that give me my second year in grad school, where these were the bad ideas, the totality, this kind of subject object.
Yeah, that's Levinas though. That's he wrote that totality and infinity, and it got us all in trouble.
Right. I realized that without these concepts, it wasn't that easy for me to make sense of what I think my actual commitments have basically always been, which is that the way that the proletariat matters to capitalism is not as high stakes as being the only relevant political actor, or being the only people who do anything ever, or the only interests that matter, or even having all the same interest. The point of it is this relationship to the universalizing tendencies of what basically drives the overall development of the society, on the whole. And so at that, if that's true, that kind of oppositional and mutually constitutive contradiction between capital and labor, and because I do think capital basically dominates the whole face of the planet, and if that contradiction is there, then there's a really important reason to be interested in the proletariat as a subject, as a potential agent, as a thing to organize. All of that has always made sense to me over and against all of the various objections about difference and homogenization and all of this. I always kind of thought that a lot of these objections, to be honest, were missing the point in some way. And rereading this, I'm they are absolutely missing the point, because he's not saying anything about it of those things. There's there's a deeper logical problem here with understanding the social process that's at stake, and it has nothing to do. I mean, it's related to, but it's sideways of that stuff. It's not quite the same problem, and I feel kind of disavowing an interest in this way of thinking, because it seemed arcane and outdated, was really a hindrance in my ability to think about this. So anyway, I'll just leave it there. I just wonder if people or listeners feel the same way, because I found this very useful.
Yeah, I was saying before we came on, just now, that I feel my brain was really continental pilled for a long time, and it made it hard. I would immediately see things that, phrases or formulations that smell of humanism, or talk of consciousness and self-consciousness, or concepts like totality, and kind of cringe a little bit. And I don't know now, I mean, when I read Lukács, and I read stuff from this period too, I don't know, I feel I would take any amount of just kind of vulgar expressions or things that might seem outdated or might be problematic in a certain way here or there, for thought with a clear practical horizon, thought with clear stakes, thought that is so powerfully able to illuminate social conditions. I feel there's a period, at least for me, where I feel I got really caught up in getting hung up on terminology and having meta discourse instead of seeing what's actually at issue in the thought and the extent to which it's either helpful and illuminating or not. I don't know.
Yeah.
Agreed entirely. Well, I think that does it for us today. New episodes of What's Left of Philosophy come out every 2 weeks, wherever you get your podcasts. Also check us out on YouTube for videos and live streams. Before closing out today, we'd like to take a minute to thank some of the people who are supporting the show on Patreon. We couldn't do this without you, and we're really grateful. Today's new patrons are Bryn Gross, Nico Osaka, Colton Green, Francesca C. Shields, Mehdi Shakarchi, Isabel Meija Natividad, Noon Cousin, Paidea, Nick Clancy, Tom O'Shea, Ben B., David Riga, Julius David Schultz, Luke Roberts, Isabel Estrada, Carter, Matthew Gordon, John, Scott Gengras, and Brian Scholl. Thank you all very much. If you too like what we're doing and want to support the show, please go to our website, leftofphilosophy.com, and hit the support button. Patrons get access to exclusive content like locked episodes and bonus videos. Follow us on Twitter at leftofphil, and don't forget to leave us good reviews and comments on your podcast app. With that, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.